I want you to imagine something with me for just a moment. Picture a decorated war hero, the very first American ace of the Second World War, climbing into the cockpit of his fighter plane on what should be an ordinary training flight. This man has flown through storms of enemy fire over the Pacific. He's stared down Japanese fighters, survived impossible odds, and come home wearing the nation's highest honors. He's a symbol of American courage, a name that appears in newspapers across the country. But on this quiet November day in 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Boyd "Buzz" Wagner takes off from a Florida airfield and simply vanishes into the clouds. No mayday call, no warning, just gone. For 6 long weeks, no one knows what happened. The military searches, families pray, the newspapers speculate. And somewhere in the tangled forests of Florida, the answer waits in silence. This is the haunting story of how America's first ace of World War II disappeared during what should have been a routine flight, and how, decades later, the forest finally gave up its secret. To understand the man behind this mystery, though, we need to go back to where it all began, a small town in Pennsylvania, where a young boy first looked up at the sky and dreamed of flight. Boyd Wagner was born on October 26, 1916, in a little place called Emay, Pennsylvania. Now, if you've never heard of Emay, you're not alone. It's the kind of town that doesn't make it onto most maps, a coal mining community tucked into the rugged hills near Johnstown. Boyd grew up in nearby Nanty Glo, another small mining town where life was simple. Families were close-knit, and most folks expected their sons to follow them into the mines. But Boyd Wagner had different ideas. From an early age, he was fascinated by machines, particularly the ones that could fly. Remember, this was the 1920s and early 30s, when aviation was still relatively new, still magical. Charles Lindbergh had just crossed the Atlantic. Barnstormers were touring the country, performing aerial stunts at county fairs. For a boy in rural Pennsylvania, the idea of flight must have seemed like pure freedom. Wagner was a smart kid, determined and focused. He made his way to the University of Pittsburgh, where he studied aeronautical engineering. Think about that for a moment. A young man from a coal mining town pursuing one of the most cutting-edge fields of his time. He wasn't just dreaming about flying. He was learning how planes worked, how they were built, what made them soar or fall. And in 1938, Boyd Wagner made the decision that would change his life forever. He joined the United States Army Air Corps. Now, back then, military aviation was still finding its identity. The Air Corps was part of the Army. The independent Air Force wouldn't exist until after the war. But even so, becoming an Army pilot was prestigious. It required skill, discipline, and nerve. The training was rigorous. Not everyone made it through. Boyd Wagner did. He completed his flight training in 1938, and his instructors immediately recognized something special in him. He had a natural feel for aircraft, an intuitive understanding of how to push a plane to its limits without crossing the line. He flew with precision, but also with boldness. His fellow pilots described him as quietly determined, not a showboat, not someone who needed to brag about his skills. He just flew, and he flew brilliantly. In 1940, Wagner received orders that would set the stage for his place in history. He was assigned to the Philippines with the 24th Pursuit Group, eventually taking command of the 17th Pursuit Squadron. It was there, flying over the tropical islands of the Pacific, that he earned his famous nickname. They called him Buzz. The name came from his habit of making daring, low-altitude passes, buzzing targets, buzzing airfields, flying so low you could practically see the expressions on people's faces below. It was risky, but it was effective. And it perfectly captured Boyd Wagner's approach to flying. Aggressive, fearless and precise. For more than a year, he trained his pilots, flew patrols, and prepared for a war that everyone knew was coming. The tensions with Japan had been building for years. Military leaders understood that conflict in the Pacific was likely inevitable. But when it finally came, it came with a fury that shocked everyone. Everything changed on December 8, 1941. Actually, let me back up just slightly because the timeline is important here. On December 7, 1941, a date that, as President Roosevelt said, would live in infamy, Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. But because of the international dateline and time zone differences, when they attacked the Philippines, it was already December 8 local time. Boyd Wagner was stationed at Nichols Field when the Japanese struck. The attack was devastating. American air power in the Philippines was caught largely unprepared, and in the first few days of the war, a significant portion of U.S. aircraft were destroyed on the ground or shot out of the sky. But Wagner wasn't about to sit still and let it happen. On December 12, 1941, just days after the war began, Lieutenant Wagner took off alone on a reconnaissance mission over Perry, a coastal area in northern Luzon. He was flying a Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, the distinctive fighter with the shark-mouth nose art that would become iconic in the Pacific theater. The P-40 wasn't the fastest plane in the sky, and it couldn't climb as high as some Japanese fighters, but in the hands of a skilled pilot, it was deadly. Wagner was flying solo when he spotted them, a formation of Japanese aircraft. Now, different accounts give different details about exactly what happened next. Some early reports said they were Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, Japan's frontline fighter that had already earned a fearsome reputation. Later analysis suggested they were actually Nakajima Ki-27s, called Nates by the Allies, which were slightly older but still dangerous adversaries. What we know for certain is this: Wagner was outnumbered, alone, and in enemy territory. Most pilots would have turned back. Most pilots would have radioed for help or tried to escape. Boyd Buzz Wagner attacked. He dove into the enemy formation with guns blazing. The P-40's .650 caliber machine guns roared to life, and within minutes, Wagner had shot down multiple Japanese aircraft. The exact number has been debated by historians. Some accounts say 4, others say 5, but what's undisputed is that in that single engagement, Boyd Wagner became the first pilot in the United States Army Air Forces to achieve ace status in World War II. An ace in military aviation is a pilot who has shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft. It's a mark of exceptional skill and courage, and Wagner had earned it in one remarkable fight. For his actions that day, Wagner was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military decoration for valor, just below the Medal of Honor. At 25 years old, this kid from a Pennsylvania coal town had become a national hero, but his war was far from over. On December 17th and again on December 22nd, Wagner led attacks on Japanese airfields at Vigan. These weren't just defensive patrols, these were offensive strikes, taking the fight to the enemy. Wagner led his squadron in low over enemy positions, strafing parked aircraft, engaging fighters that rose to meet them, and destroying valuable enemy resources on the ground. During one of these missions, Wagner's plane was hit by enemy fire. Fragments tore through his canopy, and he sustained facial injuries from shrapnel or debris. Blood ran down his face as he flew, but he held his formation, completed the mission, and brought his damaged P-40 back to base. Can you imagine that? Flying through enemy fire, wounded, knowing that one more hit could send you spiraling into the jungle below, but staying calm enough to complete your mission and land safely. That was the kind of man Boyd Wagner was. By January 1942, the situation in the Philippines had become untenable. Japanese forces were overwhelming the islands, and American and Filipino troops were being pushed back into the Bataan Peninsula. The famous battling bastards of Bataan would hold out for months, but it was clear that the Philippines would fall. Wagner was evacuated to Australia, where American forces were regrouping and preparing for the long campaign to push back across the Pacific. But even wounded, even after months of intense combat, Wagner wasn't done fighting. His legend was only growing stronger, and his next assignment would take him to one of the most brutal battlegrounds of the Pacific War, New Guinea. By this point, Wagner had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, a remarkable rise for someone so young, but his combat record spoke for itself. He was assigned to the 8th Fighter Group, and this time he'd be flying a different aircraft, the Bell P-39 Airacobra. The P-39 was an unusual fighter. Unlike most aircraft where the engine is in the nose, the P-39's engine was mounted behind the pilot, and it fired through a propeller hub-mounted cannon. It wasn't beloved by all pilots. It had some quirks and limitations. But in the hands of someone like Wagner, it was still a formidable weapon. On April 30th, 1942, Wagner shot down additional enemy aircraft during combat operations over New Guinea. His total confirmed victories now stood at 8 enemy aircraft destroyed. 8 times he'd faced enemy pilots in aerial combat and emerged victorious. 8 families in Japan had lost sons or fathers because Boyd Wagner was faster, smarter, and more skilled in the deadly dance of air-to-air combat. But sometimes heroes are needed elsewhere. And by the middle of 1942, Washington had other plans for America's first ace. The military brass made a decision that Wagner didn't like but couldn't argue with. They recalled him to the United States. At first glance, it might seem like a reward. Bring the war hero home, let him rest, give him a break from combat. But that's not how Wagner saw it, and that's not really why they brought him back. The Army needed experienced combat pilots to train the next generation. Thousands of young men were going through flight school, learning to fly, learning to fight. But there's a difference between peacetime training and the real thing. There's a world of difference between learning maneuvers over Kansas farmland and fighting for your life against experienced enemy pilots over the Pacific. Wagner had that combat experience. He knew what worked and what got you killed. He'd learned lessons written in blood and fire, and the military wanted him to pass those lessons on. So Wagner found himself assigned to work with the Curtiss Wright Corporation factory in Buffalo, New York. His job was to help improve the P-40's performance, to take what he'd learned in combat and translate it into better aircraft for the pilots who'd follow him into battle. He also spent time training new pilots, sharing his tactics, teaching young men how to survive their first encounters with the enemy. It was important work. Vital work, really. Every pilot Wagner trained, every improvement he helped make to the P-40, could save American lives and win battles. But Boyd Wagner resented it. Not because he didn't understand the importance, he did, but because his heart was still in the Pacific, still with his squadron, still in the fight. He was 26 years old, at the peak of his abilities, and while he was teaching others to fly, his fellow pilots were fighting and dying thousands of miles away. For a man like Wagner, someone who'd built his reputation on aggressive action and fearless combat, sitting stateside felt like being sidelined. Still, he served dutifully. That was the kind of man he was. When the Army gave him orders, he followed them, whether he liked them or not. He flew training missions, tested aircraft, shared his knowledge, and did everything that was asked of him. And then came November 29th, 1942. The flight that should have been routine, but wasn't. Wagner was stationed at Eglin Field in Florida, officially known as Eglin Army Airfield at the time. Eglin was and still is a major military installation, used for testing, training, and tactical development. On that day, Wagner was scheduled to fly a Curtiss P-40K Warhawk from Eglin to Maxwell Field in Alabama. It was a short flight, maybe an hour or so, depending on conditions. The kind of flight Wagner had made hundreds of times before. The weather was described as routine, nothing that would concern an experienced pilot. Wagner had flown through tropical storms over the Pacific, through enemy fire, through conditions that would ground lesser pilots. A November day in Florida shouldn't have posed any challenge at all. He climbed into his P-40K, ran through his pre-flight checks, and took off. And then, somewhere between Eglin and Maxwell, Boyd Buzz Wagner disappeared. There was no distress call, no radio communication indicating any problem. The aircraft simply vanished from radar, and Wagner never arrived at Maxwell Field. When he didn't show up, alarm bells started ringing. This wasn't some inexperienced student pilot. This was a decorated combat veteran, a national hero, someone who'd flown through hell and back. His disappearance wasn't something that could be quietly overlooked. The military launched a massive search effort. Aircraft crisscrossed the flight path, searching for any sign of wreckage. Ground crews combed through the forests and swamps of the Florida Panhandle. Local authorities were notified. Civilians were asked to report anything unusual. For days, then weeks, the search continued. They found nothing. Can you imagine what that must have been like? For his family back in Pennsylvania, waiting for news that never came? For his fellow pilots who'd served with him, who knew his skills, who couldn't understand how someone like Wagner could simply vanish? For 6 long weeks, the mystery deepened. Families waited. Commanders speculated. Newspapers ran stories, wondering what had happened to America's first ace. And somewhere in the tangled forests of northern Florida, the answer lay waiting in silence. Then, in January 1943, someone found it. The wreckage was discovered approximately 25 miles east of Eglin Field. The P-40K had crashed in a heavily forested area, the kind of terrain where a downed aircraft could easily remain hidden for weeks or even months. The impact had been catastrophic. Whatever happened, Wagner wouldn't have survived. Even today, more than 80 years later, there's no definitive public explanation for what caused the crash. The official reports from the time don't give us a clear answer. Was it mechanical failure? Some structural problem with the aircraft that manifested mid-flight? The P-40 was generally reliable, but any machine can fail. Was it pilot error? That seems unlikely given Wagner's experience, but even the best pilots can make mistakes, especially if they're distracted or dealing with an unexpected situation. Was it weather? Perhaps conditions changed rapidly, or Wagner encountered something unexpected. We simply don't know. What we do know is that partial remains were recovered from the crash site and identified as Lieutenant Colonel Boyd Wagner. The news sent shockwaves through the military community and across the nation. America's first ace of World War II, the hero who'd faced down Japanese fighters and survived the early dark days of the Pacific War, had died in a training accident in Florida. The funeral was held in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, back in the coal country where Wagner had grown up. He was laid to rest at Grandview Cemetery, and what happened next showed just how much this small-town boy had meant to his nation. Up to 20,000 people attended his funeral. 20,000. In a small Pennsylvania city, in the middle of a world war, when travel was difficult and gasoline was rationed, 20,000 people came to pay their respects. The streets were lined with mourners. Veterans stood at attention. Families who'd sent their own sons off to war came to honor a young man who'd fought for all of them. The funeral was covered by Time magazine and Life magazine, 2 of the most prominent publications in America. For a brief moment, the nation paused to remember Boyd Buzz Wagner, to honor his service, and to mourn his loss. And then, as wars do, World War II continued. New aces emerged, new battles were fought, new heroes rose to take Wagner's place in the headlines. His story became part of history, filed away in books and records and memories. Grandview Cemetery became his final resting place, and for decades that seemed to be the end of the story. But the forest hadn't revealed all its secrets yet, not for another 65 years. Sometimes the truth waits a very long time before it comes to light. In the early 2000s, a retired Air Force colonel named Jim Moschgat became interested in Wagner's story. Moschgat was a historian and researcher, someone who believed that the sacrifices of men like Wagner deserved to be fully understood and properly honored. As he dug into the records of Wagner's crash, something bothered him. The official report seemed incomplete. The crash site location seemed uncertain, and there were questions about whether all of Wagner's remains had actually been recovered back in 1943. Moschgat decided to reopen the investigation. Using modern research techniques, historical records, and good old-fashioned detective work, he began trying to pinpoint the exact location of the 1942 crash site. Remember, this was decades later. The forests had grown. The landscape had changed. Whatever markers or evidence had existed in 1943 were long gone. But Moschgat persisted. In 2008, 66 years after Wagner disappeared, a team returned to the suspected crash site in the forests of northern Florida. Using metal detectors and careful excavation techniques, they began searching the area, and they found something: human remains, aircraft fragments, personal artifacts. The items were sent for analysis, but this time, investigators had tools that didn't exist in 1943. They had DNA testing, advanced forensic techniques, and detailed records to compare against. The analysis took time. This wasn't something that could be rushed. The remains had been in the ground for more than 6 decades. The work had to be painstaking and thorough. Finally, in 2010, the confirmation came. The remains belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Boyd "Buzz" Wagner. The announcement brought closure to a mystery that had lingered for nearly 70 years. But more than that, it gave the military and Wagner's family, what remained of it, a chance to honor him properly one final time. In 2010, Boyd Wagner was laid to rest again, this time with full military honors that befitted America's first ace of World War II. A flyover was organized, modern Air Force jets roaring overhead in the missing man formation, a powerful tribute that never fails to bring tears to the eyes of those who understand what it means. Wagner was returned to Grandview Cemetery in Johnstown, back to the Pennsylvania hills where his journey had begun so many years before. This wasn't just the end of a search. It was the closing of a chapter in American military history, a final salute to a hero who'd been waiting in the forest for someone to bring him home. So, what's the legacy of Boyd "Buzz" Wagner? What do we remember when we remember his story? First and foremost, he was the first ace of the United States Army Air Forces in World War II. That distinction can never be taken away. In the chaotic, desperate early days of the Pacific War, when America was reeling from Pearl Harbor and the Philippines were falling, Wagner showed that American pilots could fight, could win, could stand against the Japanese war machine. He gave his country hope when hope was in short supply. Second, he was a pioneer of aggressive air tactics in the Pacific. Wagner didn't wait for the enemy to come to him. He took the fight to them. His low-altitude attacks, his willingness to engage even when outnumbered, his combination of skill and audacity, all of these became part of the tactical playbook that American pilots would use throughout the Pacific campaign. Third, Wagner represented something deeply American. The idea that extraordinary heroism can come from the most ordinary places. He wasn't from a military family. He wasn't from wealth or privilege. He was a kid from a coal mining town in Pennsylvania who dared to dream of flight, who worked hard to make that dream real, and who rose to meet the moment when his nation needed him most. And finally, Wagner's story reminds us that heroism comes with a price, and that price isn't always paid on the battlefield. Wagner survived months of combat in the Pacific. He survived wounds, mechanical failures, overwhelming odds. But he died on a routine training flight in Florida, probably never knowing what went wrong, never having a chance to fight back or save himself. His disappearance underscored a truth that every military family knows. Even peacetime flying carries danger. Even routine missions can turn tragic. The men and women who serve in our military accept risks every single day, whether they're in a combat zone or training over friendly territory. Every time a pilot straps into a cockpit, every time a soldier goes out on an exercise, every time a sailor sets to sea, there's an element of danger. Wagner's death, as tragic as it was, highlights the courage it takes simply to serve, even when you're not facing an enemy. Let me bring this story home with a few final thoughts. Boyd Buzz. Wagner's life follows an arc that seems almost too perfect for a movie script. Pennsylvania boy discovers passion for flight, becomes a military pilot, transforms into a war hero, and then vanishes under mysterious circumstances, only to be found decades later and honored anew. But this isn't a movie script. This is real American history, a true story of courage, sacrifice, and the long journey home. Wagner's skill and bravery changed the course of early Pacific combat. His victories came at a time when America desperately needed them. His tactics influenced how we fought in the air for the rest of the war, and his story, including its mysterious and tragic end, became part of the larger tapestry of World War II, one thread among millions, but a significant one. When those 20,000 people came to his funeral in 1943, they understood something important. They understood that Wagner represented the best of what a generation was fighting for. And when he was finally laid to rest with full honors in 2010, it was another generation's way of saying, we haven't forgotten. We won't forget. Some heroes fall in battle, facing their enemy with courage in their final moments. Others are claimed by silence, by accidents, by circumstances beyond their control, by the simple fact that flying is inherently dangerous, even without someone shooting at you. But all of them deserve to be remembered. All of them deserve to have their stories told and retold, passed down through generations, preserved as part of our national memory. Boyd Buzz Wagner flew into history on December 12, 1941, when he became America's first ace. He vanished into mystery on November 29, 1942, when his P-40 disappeared over Florida. And he came home, finally and fully, in 2010, when modern technology and determined researchers brought closure to his family and his nation. If this story has moved you, if you believe these chapters of American history should never be lost, I hope you'll take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. We're dedicated to preserving these stories, to honoring the veterans who served, and to making sure that heroes like Boyd Wagner are remembered not just as names in history books, but as real people who lived, fought, and sacrificed for all of us. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us about veterans you've known, heroes in your own family, or other forgotten stories that deserve to be remembered. Which hero should we honor next? What chapter of history should we explore together? Because these stories matter. These lives matter. And as long as we keep telling them, as long as we keep remembering, these heroes never truly die. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for remembering Boyd Buzz Wagner. And thank you for honoring all those who served.